Hello, everyone. It's Miss Wright. I'm here today to read for you the first three chapters of our new novel that we are reading in ELA, which is Pax. I know it probably looks backwards to you, but it is Pax by Sarah Pennypacker. This book was in the running for an award called the National Book Award, and they were on the long list for that award. So that means while they didn't get the award, they got pretty close. They got on the list that they would have considered for it. So that is a mark that this is probably a pretty good book. The book has some illustrations, and it is illustrated by John Clausen. So here's one of the illustrations at the beginning. We'll start with chapter 1. Just because it isn't happening here doesn't mean it isn't happening. And that's the statement right at the beginning. The fox felt the car slow before the boy did, as he felt everything first. Through the pads of his paws, along his spine, in the sensitive whiskers at his wrists. By the vibrations, he learned also that the road had grown coarser. He stretched up from his boy's lap and sniffed at the threads of scent leaking in through the window, which told him they were now traveling into woodlands. The sharp odors of pine, wood, bark, cones, and needles slivered through the air like blades, but beneath that, the fox recognized soft clover and wild garlic and ferns, and also 100 things he had never encountered before, but that smelled green and urgent. The boy sensed something now, too. He pulled his pet back to him and gripped his baseball glove more tightly. The boy's anxiety surprised the fox. The few times they had traveled in the car before, the boy had been calm or even excited. The fox nudged his muzzle into the glove's webbing, although he hated the leather smell. His boy always laughed when he did this. He would close the glove around his pet's head, play wrestling, and in this way the fox would distract him. But today the boy lifted his pet and buried his face in the fox's white ruff, pressing hard. It was then that the fox realized his boy was crying. He twisted around to study his face to be sure. Yes, crying, although without a sound, something the fox had never known him to do. The boy hadn't shed tears for a very long time, but the fox remembered, always before he had cried out, as if to demand that attention be paid to the curious occurrence of salty water streaming from his eyes. The fox licked at the tears and then grew more confused. There was no scent of blood. He squirmed out of the boy's arms to inspect his human more carefully, alarmed that he could have failed to notice an injury, although his sense of smell was never wrong. No, no blood. Not even the underskin pooling of a bruise or the marrow leak of a cracked bone, which had happened once. The car pulled to the right, and the suitcase beside them shifted. By its scent, the fox knew it held the boy's clothing and the things from his room he handled most often. The photo he kept on the top of his bureau and the items he hid in the bottom drawer. He pawed at a corner, hoping to pry the suitcase open enough for the boy's weak nose to smell these favored things and be comforted. But just then the car slowed again, this time to a rumbling crawl. The boy slumped forward, his head in his hands. The fox's heartbeat climbed and the bushy hairs of his tail lifted. The charred metal scent of the father's new clothing was burning his throat. He leapt to the window and scratched at it. Sometimes at home his boy would raise a similar glass wall if he did this. He always felt better when the glass wall was lifted. Instead, the boy pulled him down onto his lap again and spoke to his father in a begging tone. The fox had learned the meaning of many human words. He heard him use one of them now. No. Often, no was linked to one of the two names he knew, his own and his boy's. He listened carefully, but today it was just the no, pleaded to his father over and over. The car juddered to a full stop and tilted off to the right, a cloud of dust rising beyond the window. The father reached over the seat again, and after saying something to his son in a soft voice that didn't match his hard lie scent, he grasped the fox by the scruff of his neck. His boy did not resist, so the fox did not resist. He hung limp and vulnerable to the man's grasp, although he was now frightened enough to nip. He would not displease his humans today. The father opened the car door and strode over gravel and patchy weeds to the edge of the wood. The boy got out and followed. The father set the fox down, and the fox bounded out of his reach. He locked his gaze on his two humans, surprised to notice they were nearly the same height now. The boy had grown very tall recently. The father pointed to the woods. The boy looked at his father for a long moment, his eyes streaming again, and then he dried his face with the neck of his t-shirt and nodded. He reached into his jeans pocket and withdrew an old plastic soldier, the fox's favorite toy. The fox came to alert, ready for a familiar game. His boy would throw the toy, and he would track it down, a feat the boy always seemed to find remarkable. He would retrieve the toy and wait with it in his mouth until the boy found it and took it back to toss again. Sure enough, the boy held the toy soldier aloft and hurled it into the woods. The fox's relief, they were only here to play a game, made him careless. He streaked towards the woods without looking back at his humans. If he had, he would have seen the boy wrench away from his father and cross his arms over his face, and he would have returned. Whatever his boy needed, protection, distraction, affection, he would have offered. Instead, he set off after the toy, finding it was slightly more difficult than usual, as there were so many other, fresher odors in the woods. But only slightly. After all, the scent of his boy was also on the toy. That scent he could find anywhere. The toy soldier lay face down at the burled root of a butternut tree, as if he had pitched it himself there in despair. His rifle, its butt pressed tirelessly against his face, was buried to the hilt in leaf litter. The fox nudged the toy free, took it between his teeth, and rose on his haunches to allow his boy to find him. In the still woods, the only movements were bars of sunlight glinting like green glass through the leafy canopy. He reached higher. There was no sign of his boy. A prickle of worry shivered up the fox's spine. He dropped the toy and barked. There was no response. He barked again, and again it was answered by only silence. If this was a new game, he did not like it. He picked up the toy soldier and began to retrace his trail. As he loped out of the woods, a jay streaked above him, shrieking. The fox froze, torn. His boy was waiting to play the game. But birds! Hours upon hours he had watched birds from his pen, quivering at the sight of them slicing the sky as recklessly as the lightning he often saw on summer evenings. The freedom of their flight always mesmerized him. The jay called again, deeper in the forest now, but answered by a chorus of reply. For one more moment, the fox hesitated, peering into the trees for another sight of the electric blue wedge. Then, behind him, he heard a car door slam shut, and then another. He bounded at full speed, heedless of the briars that tore at his cheeks. The car's engine roared to life, and the fox skidded to a stop at the edge of the road. His boy rolled down the window and reached his arms out. As the car sped away in a pelting spray of gravel, the father cried out the boy's name, "Peter!" And the boy cried out the only other name the fox knew, "Pax!" Chapter 2. So there were lots of them. Peter heard how stupid it looked, but he couldn't help repeating it. Lots. He plowed his fingers through the heap of plastic soldiers in the battered cookie tin, identical except for their poses, standing, kneeling, and prone, all the rifles pressed hard to their olive green cheeks. I always thought he just had one. No, I was always stepping on them. He must have had hundreds, a whole army of them. The grandfather laughed at his own accidental joke, but Peter didn't. He turned his head and looked intently out the window, as if he had just caught sight of something in the darkening backyard. He raised a hand to draw his knuckles up to his jaw line, exactly the way his father rasps his beard stubble, and wiped surreptitiously at the tears that had brimmed. What kind of a baby cried at something like this? And why was he crying at all anyway? He was 12, and he hadn't cried for years, not even when he'd fractured his thumb bare-handling Josh Horenhahn's pop fly. That had hurt a lot, but he'd only cursed through the pain waiting with the coach for x-rays. Man up. But today, twice. Peter lifted a soldier from the tin and drifted back to the day he'd found one just like it in his father's desk. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up. Peter's father had reached over and taken it, his face softening. "Huh, been a long time. That was my favorite toy when I was a kid. Can I have it?" His father tossed the soldier back. "Sure." Peter had set it up on the windowsill beside his bed, pointing the little plastic rifle out of a satisfying show of defense. But within the hour, Pax had swiped it, which made Peter laugh. Just like him, Pax had to have it. Peter dropped the toy back into the tin and was about to snap the lid back when he noticed the edge of a yellowed photo sticking up from the mound of soldiers. He tugged it free. His dad, maybe 10 or 11, with one arm draped around a dog. Looked like part collie, part 100 other things. Looked like a good dog, the kind you would tell your own son about. "I never knew you had a dog," he said, passing the photo to his grandfather. "That's Duke. Dumbest creature ever born. Always underfoot." The old man looked closely at the picture and then over at Peter as if seeing something for the first time. "You've got the same black hair as your dad." He rubbed at the fringe of gray fuzz banding the top of his head. I had it too, way back. And look, he was scrawny then, too, same as you, same as me, with those ears like a jug. The men in our family, I guess our apples don't fall too far from the tree, eh? No, sir. Peter forced a small smile, but it didn't hold up. Underfoot. That was the word Peter's father had used. He can't have the fox underfoot. He doesn't move as fast as he used to. You stay out of the way, too. He's not used to having a kid around. You know, war came and I went and served like my father, like your father now. Duty calls, and we answered in this family. No, sir, our apples don't fall far from the tree. He handed back the photo. Your father and that dog, they were inseparable. I'd almost forgotten. Peter put the photo back into the tin and pressed the lid down tight, then slid it under the bed where he'd found it. He looked out the window again. He couldn't risk talking about pets right now. He didn't want to hear about duty. And he sure didn't want to hear any more about apples and trees that they were stuck underneath. What time does school start here? He asked, not turning around. 8. They said to show up early, introduce yourself to your homeroom teacher, Mrs. Merez or Ramirez, something. I got you some supplies. The old man nodded over a spiral notebook, a beat-up thermos, and a bunch of stubby pencils bundled together with a thick rubber band. Here's a picture of the toy that he found. Peter walked over to the desk and put everything into his backpack. Thanks. Bus or walk? Walk. Your father went to that school, and he walked. Follow Ash to the road. Turn right on School Street, and you'll see it. Big brick building. School Street. Get it? You leave by 7:30. You'll have plenty of time. Peter nodded. He wanted to be left alone. Okay, I'm all set. I guess I'll go to bed. Good, his grandfather replied, not bothering to hide the relief in his voice. He left, closing the door behind him firmly, as if to say, You can have this room, but the rest of the house is mine. Peter stood by the door and listened to him walk away. After a minute, he heard the sound of dishes clattering in the sink. He pictured his grandfather in the cramped kitchen where they'd eaten their silent dinner of stew, the kitchen that reeked so strongly of fried onions that Peter figured the smell would outline his grandfather. After 100 years of scrubbing by a dozen different families, this house would probably still smell bitter. Peter heard his grandfather shuffle along the hall to his bedroom, and then the low spark as the television caught, the volume turned down, an agitated news commentator barely audible. Only then did he toe off his sneakers and lie down in the narrow bed. 6 months, maybe more, of living here with his grandfather, who always seemed to be on the verge of blowing up. What's he so mad about? What's he always so mad about anyway? Peter had asked his father years ago. Everything. Life, his father had answered. He got worse after your grandmother died. After his own mother had died, Peter had watched his father anxiously. At first, there had just been a frightening silence. But gradually, his face had hardened into the permanent threat of a scowl. His hands clenched in fists by his sides as if itching for something to set him off. Peter had learned to avoid that something, learned to stay out of his way. The smell of stale grease and onions crawled over him, seeping from the walls, from the bed itself. He opened the window beside him. The April breeze that blew in was chilly. Pax had never been alone outside before, except in his pen. Peter had tried to extinguish the last sight he'd had of the fox. He probably hadn't followed their car for long, but the image of him flopping down on the gravel shoulder, confused, was worse. Peter's anxiety began to stir. All day, the whole ride here, Peter had sensed it coiling. It always seemed like a snake to him, his anxiety, waiting just out of sight, ready to slither up his spine, hissing its familiar taunt. You aren't where you should be. Something bad is going to happen because you aren't where you should be. He rolled over and pulled the cookie tin out from under his bed. He fished out the photo of his father with one arm slung so casually around the black and white dog, as if he never worried he could lose him. Inseparable. He hadn't missed that note of pride that had entered his grandfather's voice when he'd said that. Of course, he'd been proud. He'd raised a son who knew about loyalty and responsibility. Who knew that a kid and his pet could be inseparable? Suddenly the word itself seemed an accusation. He and Pax. What were they then? Separable? They weren't, though. Sometimes, in fact, Peter had had the strange sensation that he and Pax merged. The first time it happened had been the first time he'd taken Pax outdoors. The kit had seen a bird and strained against the leash, trembling as though electrified. And Peter had seen the bird through Pax's eyes. The miraculous lightning flight, the impossible freedom and speed. He felt his own skin thrill in full body shivers, and his own shoulders burn as though yearning for wings. It had happened again this afternoon. He had felt the car spin away as though he were the one being left. His heart had quickened in panic. Tears stung again, and Peter palmed them with frustrated swipes. His father had said it was the right thing to do. War is coming. It means sacrifices for everybody. I have to serve. It's my duty. And you have to go away. Of course, he'd been half expecting it. 2 of his friends' families had already packed up and left when the excavation rumors had begun. What he hadn't expected was the rest, the worst part. And the fox. Well, it's time to send him back to the wild anyway. A coyote howled then, so nearby it made Peter jump. A second one answered, and then a third. Peter sat up and slammed the window shut, but it was too late. The yips and howls, what they meant, were in his head now. Peter had only bad memories of his mother. He had a lot of good ones too, and he often took those out to comfort himself, although he worried that they might fade from so much exposure. But the 2 bad ones he'd buried deep. He did everything in his power to keep them buried. Now the 2 coyotes were baying in his head, unearthing one of them. When he'd been about 5, he'd come upon his mother standing, dismayed, beside a bed of blood-red tulips. Half of them were standing at attention, and half of them splayed over the ground, their blossoms crumbling. A rabbit got them. He must think the stems are delicious, the little devil. Peter had helped his father set a trap that night. We won't hurt him, right? Fine. We'll just catch him and drive him into the next town. Let him eat someone else's tulips. Peter had baited the trap himself with a carrot. Then he begged his father to let him sleep in the garden to keep watch. His father had said no, but helped him set an alarm clock so he'd be the first to awaken. When it went off, Peter had run to his father's room to lead her outside by the hand to see the surprise. The trap lay on its side, at the bottom of a freshly scraped crater, at least 5 feet across. Inside was a baby rabbit, dead. There wasn't a single mark on its little body, but the cage was scratched and dented, and the ground all around was clawed to rubble. Coyotes, his father said, joining them. They must have scared it to death trying to get in, and none of us even woke up. Peter's mother had opened the trap and lifted it out the lifeless form. She held it to her cheek. They were just tulips, only a few tulips. Peter found the carrot, one end nibbled off, and threw it away as far as he could. Then his mother had placed the rabbit's body in his cupped hands and gone to get a shovel. With a single finger, Peter had traced its ears, unfurling like ferns from its face, and its paws, miraculously tiny, and the soft fur of its neck slick with his mother's tears. When she returned, his mother had touched his face, which burned with shame. It's okay. You didn't know. But it wasn't okay. For a long time afterward, when Peter closed his eyes, he'd seen coyotes. Their claws raking dirt, their jaws snapping. He saw himself where he should have been, keeping watch in the garden that night. Over and over, he saw himself doing what he should have. Rise from his sleeping bag, finding a rock, and hurling it. He saw the coyotes fleeing back into the darkness, and he saw himself opening the trap to set the rabbit free. And with that memory, the anxiety snake struck so hard it had stunned Peter's breath out of him. He hadn't been where he should have been the night the coyotes killed the rabbit, and he wasn't where he should be now. He gasped to fill his lungs and sat bolt upright. He tore the photo in half and in half again and pitched the pieces under the bed. Leaving Pax hadn't been the right thing to do. He jumped to his feet. He'd already lost a lot of time. He fished some cargoes, a long-sleeve camouflage t-shirt and fleece sweatshirt from his suitcase, and then an extra set of underwear and socks. He stuffed everything into his backpack except the sweatshirt, which he tied around his waist, jackknife in his jeans pocket, wallet. He debated for a minute between his hiking boots and sneakers and decided on boots, although he didn't put them on. He looked around the room, hoping to find a flashlight or anything that resembled camping equipment. The room had been his father's when he'd been a boy, but aside from a few books on a shelf, it was clear his grandfather had cleaned all his things out. The cookie tin had seemed to surprise him, an oversight. Peter bumped his fingers over the spines of the books. An atlas. He pulled it down, amazed at his luck, and flipped through it until he came to a map that showed the route he and his father had traveled. You'll only be 300 miles away. His father had tried to bridge the silence of the drive a couple times. I get a day off, I'll come. Peter had known that it would never happen. They didn't give off days in war. Besides, it wasn't his father he was already missing. And then he saw something he hadn't realized. The highway snaked around a long range of foothills. If he cut straight across those instead of following the highway, he could save a lot of time, plus reduce the risk of being caught. He started to rip out the page, and then he realized he couldn't leave his grandfather with such an obvious clue. Instead, he studied the map for a long moment and replaced the atlas on the shelf. 300 miles. It looked like he could shave off 100 of them by taking a shortcut, so say around 200. If he could walk at least 30 miles a day, he could make it in a week or less. They'd left Pax at the head of the access road that led to the ruins of the old rope mill. Peter had insisted on this road because hardly anyone ever used it. Pax didn't know about traffic, and because there were woods and fields all around. He'd go back and find Pax there waiting in 7 days. He wouldn't let himself think about what might happen to a tame fox in those 7 days. No, Pax would be waiting at the side of the road, right where he'd left him. He'd be hungry for sure, and probably scared, but he'd be okay. Peter would take him home. They would stay there. Just let someone try to make him leave this time. That was the right thing to do. He and Pax, inseparable. He glanced around the room again, resisting the urge to just run. He couldn't afford to miss anything. The bed. He took the blanket off, rumpled the sheets, and punched the pillow until it looked slept on. From his suitcase, he took out the picture of his mother he kept on the bureau, the one taken on her last birthday, holding up the kite Pete had made for her, and smiling as if she'd never had a better present in her life, and slid it into his backpack. Next, he pulled out the things of hers that he'd kept hidden in his bottom drawer at home. Her gardening gloves, still smudged with the last soil she'd ever lifted, a box of her favorite tea, which had long ago lost its peppermint scent, the thick candy cane striped knee socks she wore in winter. He touched them all, wishing he could take everything back home where it belonged, then chose the smallest of the items, a gold bracelet with an enameled phoenix charm she wore every day, and tucked it into the middle of his backpack with the photo. Peter surveyed the room a last time. He eyed his baseball and glove and crossed to the bureau and stuffed them into the backpack. They didn't weigh much, and he'd want them when he was back home. Besides, he just felt better when he had them. Then he eased the door open and crept into the kitchen. He set the backpack on the oak table, and in the dim light from the stove, he began to pack supplies. A box of raisins, a sleeve of crackers, a half-empty jar of peanut butter. Pax would come out of any hiding spot for peanut butter. From the refrigerator, he took a bunch of string cheese sticks and 2 oranges. He filled the thermos with water and hunted through the drawers until he found matches, and he wrapped in tinfoil. Under the sink, he scored 2 lucky finds, a roll of duct tape and a box of heavy-duty garbage bags. A tarp would have been better, but he took the 2 bags with gratitude and zipped the pack. Finally, he took a sheet of paper from the pad beside the phone and began to write. Dear Grandfather. Peter looked at the words for a minute as if they were a foreign language, and then crumpled the paper up and started a new note. I left early. Wanted to get a good start on school. See you tonight. He stared at the page for a while too, wondering if it sounded as guilty as he felt. At last, he added, Thanks for everything, Peter. Placed the note under the salt shaker and slipped out. On the brick walk, he shrugged on his sweatshirt and crouched to lace his boots. He straightened up and shouldered his backpack. Then he took a moment to look around. The house behind him looked smaller than it had when he'd arrived, as if it were already receding into the past. Across the street, clouds scudded along the horizon, and a half-moon suddenly emerged, brightening the road ahead. Chapter 3. Pax was hungry and cold, but what had woken him was the sense that he needed cover. He blinked and edged backward. What felt like the comforting bars of his pen gave way in brittle snaps. He turned to find the stand of dried milkweed stalks he'd wedged himself in against a few hours before. He barked for Peter and remembered. His boy was gone. Pax wasn't used to being alone. He'd been born into a squirming litter of 4, but his father had disappeared before the kits had even learned his scent, and soon after that his mother had failed to come home one morning. One by one, his brothers and sisters had died, leaving the only heartbeat in the cold den until the boy, Peter, had lifted him out. Since that time, whenever the boy was gone, Pax would pace in his pen until Peter returned. And at night he always whined to come inside, where he could listen to his humans breathing. Pax loved his boy, but more than that, he felt responsible for Peter, for protecting him. When he couldn't perform that role, he suffered. Pax shook off the night's rain from his back and headed for the road without even stretching his stiff muscles, straining for his boy's scent. He couldn't find it. The night's winds had swept the ground clean of any trace. But along the hundreds of odors rising on the early morning breeze, he found something that reminded him of his boy: acorns. Peter often scooped up handfuls and sprinkled them over Pax's back, laughing to see him shake them off and then crack them to get the meat. A familiar scent seemed to promise to him now, and he trotted towards it. The acorns were scattered across the base of a lightning oak a few full bounds north of where he had last seen his boy. He crunched a few of them, but only found a shriveled, moldy nubs inside. Then he settled himself on the fallen trunk, ears strained for any sound on the road. While he waited, Pax licked his fur dry and clean, taking comfort in the lingering Peter scent he found there. Then he turned his attention to his forepaws, painstakingly cleaning the many cuts in their pads. Whenever he was anxious, Pax dug at the floor of his pen. He always shredded his paws on the rough concrete buried beneath, but he could not control the urge. In the week before, he dug nearly every day. When his paws were cleaned, he curled them up under his chest to wait. The morning air pulsed with the noises of spring. The long night before, they had alarmed Pax. The blackness had quivered with the rustle of night prowlers, and even the sounds of trees themselves, leaves unfurling, sap coursing up new wood, the tiny cracklings of expanding bark, had startled him over and over as he waited for Peter to return. Finally, as dawn had begun to silver the sky, he'd fallen into a shivering sleep. Now, though, the same sounds called to him. 100 times his sensitive ears pricked, and he almost sprang up to investigate. But each time he remembered his boy and stilled himself. The humans had good memories, so they would come back to this spot. But they relied on sight alone, all their other senses being so weak, so if they did not see him when they returned, they might leave again. Pax would stay beside the road and ignore all temptations, including the strong urge he felt to head south, the direction his instinct told him would lead him back to his home. He would stay at this spot until the boy came for him. Up above, a vulture cruised the thermals. A lazy hunter, it was searching for the lifeless shape of carrion. When it found the red-furred form of the fox, motionless but giving off no odor of decay, it circled lower to investigate. Pax registered an instinctive alarm at the cool flicker of a V-shaped shadow. He jumped from the trunk and scratched at the dirt beneath. The ground seemed to answer with a distant rumble, like a growling heart. Pax stretched high, the danger from above forgotten. The last time he had seen his boy, There had been vibrations like this along this very road. He tore over the gravel shoulder to the exact spot where his humans had left him. The vibrations grew to a roar. Pax rose on his haunches to be seen, but the source was not his boy's car. It was not a car at all. As it loomed up, it seemed to the fox to be as large as the house his humans had lived in. The truck was green, not the glowing green of the trees all around, but a dull olive, a color death might wear when it claimed those trees. The same dull olive of the toy soldier the fox had cached in the milkwood stalks. It stank of diesel and the same charred metal scent that had clung to his boy's father's new clothing. In a cloud of dust and sprayed stones, the truck charged past, followed by another, and another, and another. Pax bounded away from the road. The vulture soared up and away with a single beat of its wings. That's the first 3 chapters of Pax. See you soon.